Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today, May 1st. I'd like to acknowledge that today also begins the start of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month to recognize the contributions and influence of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans to the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. A heartfelt thank you. My name is Kate McCallum, and I'm a proud member of the PGA and a co-founder of the PGA Social Impact Entertainment Task Force. The purpose of the task force is to provide events and education designed to bring expertise and information about the challenges and issues the world is facing today, and how we as content creators and storytellers can assist in providing awareness and solutions through our stories. This is the UN and PGA's third in a series of virtual workshops designed for the creative community to learn about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and explore possibilities for collaborations to make positive social impact entertainment. Historically, the UN opened an office to collaborate with the creative community after the success of working with Sydney Pollack on the 2005 movie, The Interpreter, much of which was filmed on location at the UN in New York and starred Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn. Since then, the UN Creative Community Outreach has worked with a number of films and television shows, helping with script development and social impact campaigns, as well as on-location filming. It works with organizations like ours to connect with film and TV professionals through events like today's. The focus of today's workshop, Gender Equality and Telling Stories of Women, is inspired by the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. We are honored to have a powerful lineup of guest speakers made up of visionary and passionate entertainment creatives and executives, and the extraordinary women of the UN, all amazing experts working at the worldwide leading edge of UN activities who will share with you their stories. After the second panel, we will have 20 minutes for Q&A, so please post your questions in the Q&A box below. I'd like to thank the PGA and the UN. A special thanks to my colleagues and producers, Will Nix, Anne-Marie Gillen, and Diana White, to today's wonderful speakers, and to our UN Creative Community Outreach partners for collaborating with us on this series. Without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Ramu Damodaran, the Deputy Director of the Outreach Division in the Department of Global Communications for the UN, who will introduce our first speaker, his colleague, Ms. Nella Lavalje.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for that very generous introduction to our creative community outreach. I remember when we first had a meeting with Sydney Pollack, as you said, in 2005, he said something which has remained in my mind ever since, that usually when you make a film about an idea. And that was in a sense, the inspiration which led to our creating this new unit. And I'm delighted that we have two of its leaders with us today, both women, Andi Gitow, who's now the chief of that particular branch of our department, and Dani Zapotoczny, who is, in a sense, our West Coast representative working for us and also with the UN Foundation. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we have Carlos with us, Carlos Islam, who's been working with CCY virtually since its inception. The ideas you mentioned, Kate, and this probably goes to an area which you are so familiar with, the idea of conscious creativity. In other words, creativity that is conscious of the world in which it belongs. And we like to hope that the United Nations for itself can provide the expertise, possibly even the inspiration for films that you would like to make in not necessarily just a larger social cause, but in the cause of entertainment and communication, which also serves a social purpose. You know, Eleanor Roosevelt used to keep a diary soon after she lost her husband. And I looked at the entry for May the 1st, 1946, 75 years ago. And she had had a lunch at the United Nations with members of the Human Rights Commission. And I discovered that every one of the other people at the table was a man. And that brought to mind a story that Steven Spielberg once narrated about his first meeting with Kathleen Kennedy, who went on to become president of the PGA. And he recalled that she came in as a stenographer with a notebook to take down dictation. And he said she was horrible at it. She just could not take notes. But what she was very good at was interrupting someone in mid-sentence. And I think that is what women have done to the United Nations. An organization whose foundational documents were all in the masculine noun and masculine pronoun. Women came along, they changed it, they interrupted us in mid-sentence, and they took the lead. And that is a lead which we invite all of you to take still further through the wonderful vehicles, the idioms, the metaphors, the ideas, and the inspiration at your command. I'd also like to mention that, thank you, Kate, for having mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. These have received such a tremendous jolt over the past year, not only in bringing us back from our path of progress towards the 2030 we were aspiring to, but with new dangers, violence against women and girls, which have reached unsurpassed levels throughout the world over the last 12 months. So these are ideas that we need to inhabit and reach to a larger public. Today, May the 1st, is also International Workers' Day. And I'm proud of what UN Women has tweeted today, that an economy that works for women works for the world. So there are so many threads and strands which will come in, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion which will bring them forward. It's my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Nella Lavalje, who's the Senior Gender Advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations. Nella, before joining the United Nations, worked in South Africa on issues of reconciliation. And that brings to mind one last quote I will leave you with. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who, as you know, led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, who once said, "God created man, and then she realized she could do better." Thank you. Nella, the floor is yours.
Ramu, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and I love that quote. And thank you to Kate and the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. So I've been asked to speak to you this morning about the state of the world for women. And I was thinking this morning, how do you cover such a massive topic that really is everything under the sun? And at first I thought, you know, I could share with you statistics and I could inundate you with statistics. Just this morning, I saw the most recent ones. Last year, women lost $800 billion by being forced out of the formal economy during in the midst of the pandemic that we've all been experiencing. And before the pandemic started, we knew that the richest 20 men in the world owned more wealth than all African women combined. The statistics are shocking, and they are around the world, and they exist for every country, in every community, in every sector. Women are worse off simply because they are women. From access to education to decent work, the pay gap, the savings gap, the pension gap, physical security, everyday discrimination. And of course, all of this gets exacerbated in a crisis like we've been experiencing for the last year, natural disasters, conflict. And these discriminations compound over a woman's life cycle as well. And in fact, you can imagine that a girl who is only has the opportunity for a few years of education, is married off early, is more likely to have more children, higher experience of maternal mortality, lower health, and experience extreme poverty and likely pass it on to the next generation. So really addressing gender equality and women's rights is an inflection point for us to get to all of the sustainable development goals. Because when we unlock the capacity of 50% of our population, we can address poverty, access to clean water, to clean environment, etc. But we know all of this, and when we talk about statistics, it can feel like it's amorphous and out there. But just before I move off of that thought, I will say one thing. Data is important, and in the last few years, one book that has really impacted me, and I talk about this book everywhere, so I'm going to recommend it to all of you, is a book called Invisible Women by Carolina Criado Perez. And this book really looks at how it is that when women are missing and invisible, it affects the outcomes. So everything from, for example, how we test crashes and accidents in cars. Women are more likely to be injured because we use crash test dummies that are a typical man-sized 70 kilogram, 6-foot crash test dummy, and women sit differently in a car than that. To how we do medical research, to every aspect of our lives is impacted when we don't see women. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And so I was thinking that statistics are not going to cut it. And so perhaps I can share with you some stories from around the world. And of course, if we just go, south of the border here to Mexico, where rates of femicide are so horrific, they rival many war zones in the world. And women are killed to send a signal to a rival criminal gang. They're killed by their boyfriends, by state forces, by migration gangs, etc. Or further afield, the stories of families that kill their daughters because they feel they've dishonored their families. We're hearing in the news right now in Afghanistan, a generation of young women who are scared that the Taliban will return and what that will mean for their rights, rolling back 20 years of gains that they feel that they've made. So there's no shortage of stories or statistics. But I was thinking I actually wanted to come at this a little bit differently. And I wanted to talk about why it is that we have these stories and statistics in the world. What is it that gives us these consequences and these outcomes? And really that is about gender norms. And that's something that affects every single one of us. Gender is like the air that we breathe. It's invisible, and yet it absolutely shapes everything in our lives from our first breath. Or in the case of California, even before our first breath, with the tragic gender reveal parties that we've seen in recent years. And why do I say this? Gender shapes the opportunities and the experiences that each of us have as men, women, non-binary, particularly non-binary. And it's invisible until it's visible. And the pandemic in the last year has certainly made this visible. We have never seen such attention paid to the unpaid care work that women undertake in the home, taking care of children, the elderly, the sick, on top of their regular jobs outside of the home. We've never seen such attention paid to the levels of violence, which have skyrocketed in the last year. And interestingly enough, we don't talk about violence. We talk about violence against women and girls, which makes it seem that it just happens to women and girls. We don't talk about where this violence is coming from. We don't talk about male violence against women and girls. So it sounds like a perpetratorless crime. So even the way that we talk about it renders things invisible. But this moment of brief awareness is not going to last long if we don't connect it to a deeper understanding and awareness, and if it doesn't move us to think differently and act differently. And the visibility of women's experiences in the last year has also been partial. There are stories that we are not telling in the same way. And those stories are the stories of women's leadership. And I would say that this last year has really been the story of women's leadership. We don't tell women's stories enough, and when we do, and we know this from the news, and we can quantify it, when we do tell women's stories, they're disproportionately those of victimhood. And yet really the story of this last year of COVID-19 has been the story of women's leadership. Across the board in all countries where women have been leading, the outcomes have been better for society as a whole. And this is because their styles are different, and the leadership that they make visible has been different. And if we just think about Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand as one example, this is a woman who brought her newborn baby to the General Assembly when she made her speech in front of world leaders, who responded to the massacre in her country with empathy and solidarity, who locked down her country but listened to the most vulnerable. In Norway, the Prime Minister there started doing press conferences, not for journalists, but actually for children, recognizing the way in which this pandemic was impacting on children and their mental health. Barbados, Germany, Iceland, it's not all women leaders who have been successful, but it is disproportionately women leaders who have led differently in the last year. And it's not because women are better, it's simply that they have brought different styles. And inclusion and diversity opens the door to greater inclusion, which opens the door to more solidarity, to more institutional trust, to different ways of addressing some of the global challenges that we have in the moment. And why is it important to make these stories visible? I look at the work of Iris Bonet from Harvard University, who talks about what we see is what we know that we can achieve. And when you walk into a company and all you see are photographs of old men as leadership of that company, it implicitly sends you a message about your place and value and what is achievable. And it leads me to think about this one story, and I can't remember if it was Finland or Norway, but it was a country where there had been a woman head of state for quite some time there. And one of the recent prime ministers visited a kindergarten, was asking the children what they want to become. And the little boy said, well, I want to become prime minister, but boys can't become prime minister. And of course it had been because he'd only ever seen women as prime minister and head of state in that country. So what we see really tells us what it is that we can achieve and what's normal in the world. So that made me reflect on what is visible and what is invisible, and how can we change what it is that we are aware of, and what's impacted me in making me see the invisible or think differently. So this morning I found myself listening to Beyonce's If I Were a Boy, Taylor Swift's I'd Be the Man, which both those songs, like the recent book, The Power, take the world and insert women into men's scenarios. And then expose for us the oddness of the double standards and the different outcomes that come out of that. So they make the invisible visible. And I want to just take a moment here to talk about The Handmaid's Tale, and you'll forgive me for having a fangirl moment. I know some of you have worked on this series. As somebody who works in this area, I have to say, it took the brilliance and the genius of Margaret Atwood, and it amplified it and brought it to a wide audience. And it fit the moment and the context, and it made people think. And it made people think about the logical conclusion of the world in which we're living in the moment, that nobody wanted to see. Nobody wanted to think about the logical outcome of the direction in which we were heading. And yet that conclusion is not very far away from us. If we just go to El Salvador as one example, there are dozens of women in prison today because they are suspected of inducing abortion. Many of these are women who pitched up at the hospital having miscarried and looking for health support and help, and instead were handcuffed and taken to prison. Can you imagine the trauma of grieving a loss and not knowing what's happening to your own body, and instead being handcuffed and taken away to prison to serve 30, 40 years, perhaps even life? Just a couple of weeks ago, the New York Times had an expose of a story in Venezuela where a young girl, I believe she was 12, 13, 14, had been raped by her neighbor, and had finally come forward and told her mother about it when she was missing her periods and realized what was happening. Her mother, of course, this is a country where we can't access abortion. Her mother took her to a teacher who could access pills for this. And they eventually reported it to the police. And who do you think ended up in prison? Not the suspected rapist, instead the mother and the teacher. So really the connections between what we see in places like The Handmaid's Tale and the logical conclusion that we see playing out really make us to think differently than we do at the moment. It forced us to look at the logic of treating women like walking wombs, and what's the end logic of that. And that's really important to this moment in time. You know, a few weeks ago in the UK, following the killing of Sarah Everard, there was this talk about the idea of a male curfew. And of course, many men were up in arms. You know, how could we talk about a curfew for men so that it was safe for women to go out? And then we heard comedians and artists flipping it on its head and saying, but women have curfews on them every day. Think about the dozens of decisions that women make every day, censoring themselves and what they say, who they speak to, where they go. You speak to women and you ask them, what would you do if you could do anything? And I know my friends talk about going for a jog in the evening after work, being able to go out at night by themselves, take public transportation, wear what they want to, speak to who they want to. These are freedoms and limitations that we don't think about until we make them visible. So all of this made me think that change can actually happen really quickly when we shift our mindsets and our attitudes and we see things differently. And the question for me is what unlocks that change? And I was thinking back to when I was in university, I had a colleague with me who was doing her master's on what I thought at the time was a weird topic. She was doing a master's dissertation looking at women's magazines over decades until I read this dissertation. And there was one scenario in there that really struck me. She looked at women's magazines, women's home magazines in the 1940s during World War II. And of course, the ideal woman was Rosie the Riveter, the woman in the factory working hard to support the war effort while the men were abroad. And the average recipe time in a woman's magazine in the 1940s was 30 to 35 minutes. Recipe preparation to table time. 1950s. The ideal woman in these magazines was in an apron with pearls, and the recipe preparation time average had gone up to 3.5 hours. What does that tell you? It tells you that culture shapes us. The things that we see shape us. Tell us what is the ideal woman. Tell us who we are meant to be and how we fit into society. So these things influence and impact and can really help to drive generational change. What it is that we see, who it is that we think that we're meant to be, and what the consequences of that are in every aspect of our lives. But I want to just leave it here and say, you know, there's no greater force for change than media, than the stories that we hear and see, what connects to us, how we feel a sense of injustice for a character, how we flip our thinking just by normalizing things that we normally wouldn't, how we rethink our own assumptions when things are portrayed differently, and we may not even realize how we're being challenged in our own assumptions. And I want to just end by noting some of the stories that are really exciting me right now. And this is the women, and young women in particular, who are mobilizing for change around the world, from Argentina to Sudan, from Mexico to Lebanon, UK, Australia. Women are taking to the streets in their thousands. They are mobilizing against violence. They are mobilizing for greater equality. They are mobilizing for rights, choice over their own body. They're mobilizing for a different kind of world, with climate justice at the center of it, with a different way of valuing and seeing even how we value work. Women's unpaid care work that happens in the home has no dollar value on it. And so we don't create policies that match that in society. Again, what is invisible impacts our world without us realizing. So these women around the world, thousands of women in green on the streets in Argentina celebrating the passage of abortion rights there. The women with flowers staring down the riot-geared police in Lebanon. The iconic image of Allah Saleh standing on a car in Sudan, directing the energy of the crowds that brought down the al-Bashir regime in that country after decades. These are the stories that excite me. And so I want to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from Arundhati Roy, who once wrote, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nella, for your leadership and that amazing presentation. And Ramu, thank you for your introduction. Now, please let's welcome Madeline de Nonno, who will lead the conversation with our next panel of speakers. Madeline is the president and CEO of the Geena Davis Institute on Gender in Media, which is the leading research-driven advocacy organization working within the entertainment and media industry to create gender balance, foster inclusion, and reduce negative stereotyping in family entertainment media. Madeline, welcome.
Thank you so much. So hi everyone, Madeline here. And before we get going, I wanted to introduce our esteemed ASL interpreter, Andrea Lust. Welcome, Andrea. And I also want to acknowledge that I am currently on the traditional lands of the Chumash peoples. Storytelling is our most powerful platform that can greatly influence how we perceive women and girls and how they see their value in society. And great stories can change our minds, our souls, and how we treat one another, which is the topic of our panel today, taking a deep dive in telling women's stories. I am so honored to be joined by an esteemed group of storytellers. So let me welcome, without further ado, Elaine, Organ Director of Spirit Untamed, Wendy Calhoun, Executive Producer and Writer, Edgewood Place Entertainment, and Michelle Sugihara, Executive Director, CAPE, which is the Coalition of Asian Pacific. So welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to have you here today. And so, Michelle, I'm going to ask you to kick us off. Today is the start of AAPI month. And as you have beautifully said, at CAPE, we dream of a world where what we watch on our screens reflect the world in which we live in. So can you just kind of level set, what's happening, and also talk about, how can we be allies?
Thank you so much, Madeline, and thank you everyone for having us today. I'm very excited to be here. And so at CAPE, the Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment, as Madeline just mentioned, what we strive to do is to make sure that what we watch on our screens reflects the world in which we live. And how we do that is very strategically, we identified certain critical access points within Hollywood. And so one of them being the writers, because change and narrative story and diversity and inclusion all start on the page. And the counterpart to that is also our executive fellowship, because we also need to focus on the leaders and the people who have the power to greenlight the stories and shepherd them through. And so together, that creates a new ecosystem where we're trying to change the stories that we're seeing. And our Writers Fellowship has our alums now working on every major broadcast, cable, and streamer, and they write on over 50 shows, which is very exciting. And this is the best way we feel that media is the fastest and most effective way to get the message out. And we also do a lot of consulting work because, as we all know, there's a lot more work that happens behind the scenes to get the script to really where it needs to be. And so the Geena Davis Institute, actually, they have this quote that I talk about all the time, and that's that 80% of content that is consumed globally is produced in Hollywood. And that means that we have a tremendous obligation and responsibility to make sure that the content that we're creating is done authentically and with care. So with that all said, we are striving to change the ecosystem from behind. And with that, another issue that we see a lot and which we're combating is that people say, oh, we didn't know that this talent exists. We couldn't find them. So one other thing that we're working on is an external database so that people can actually find the talent. We have it all internal and we're working on making it external. And it's a 360 database with all of the talent of Asian American Pacific Islanders working in Hollywood. And so very excited to be working on that. And then another thing we're incubating is also a producers program, because it's really important, again, going back to the leaders and the producers and the people that have the power to greenlight the stories and are being very thoughtful and conscious about which stories they are choosing to support. So lately we've been talking a lot about the recent Oscars and Chloe Zhao and her fantastic win. She was the second woman of color and, I'm sorry, the first woman of color and second woman overall to win a Best Directing Oscar in 93 years. But before we can get there, before we can have that big Oscar win, we need to have the producers who are shepherding and fostering this talent. So in 2015, producer Nina Yang Bon Jovi and her production company, Significant Productions, which she does with Forrest Whitaker, they produced Chloe Zhao's feature film at Sundance called Songs My Brothers Taught Me. So the success starts way before what we're starting to see. And so that's what I'm trying to say is, yes, it's wonderful that we have the success of the Oscars of last week, but we have to also recognize what happened before that to lead up to that point.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn to my long time friend, Holly Gordon, who is the Chief Impact Officer from Participant. So Holly, can you talk about the power of purpose in storytelling? And, you learned very early on, in your career, how that power can manifest. And I would love for you to share with our audience, what you learned about, from Girl Rising in terms of the power of voice and storytelling.
Hi, Madeline. It's so great to see so many of you who've been longtime friends in this intersectional world of story and global development and global change, because I feel as though in the world of trying to make the world a better place and to tackle some of these deep root cause issues that are rooted in beliefs, story is like a magical intervention. And so the more storytelling we can be using towards creating the world we want to see, the better. So I'm thrilled to be with all of you. And as Madeline knows, I was the co-founder and executive producer of a film and campaign called Girl Rising that was inspired by the belief that storytelling can be a transformational catalyst for long-term social change. And with Girl Rising, it came from my past as a journalist, understanding that if you could inspire people to see the world in a different way, including girls themselves, that there was possibility beyond the barriers that they face in their daily lives, that almost anything is possible. And I still do believe in that intersection of storytelling to inspire purpose. And at the end of the day, we're going to need more people all around the world in a distributed way to discover their purpose, because we need to work together dramatically to tackle the changes of the next 10, 20 years. So with Girl Rising, we saw the need for emotional storytelling that could shift hearts and minds around the value of a girl in society, so that the more leaders, parents and community members would prioritize girls and their education as a global priority. So if we could shift the beliefs of parents and shift the beliefs of presidents that girls are good for GDP, and that educating girls is a way to have better infant mortality outcomes, real key indicators that are important to both parents and leaders, then we could set a path for transformational change. And I'm happy to report that the original film that told the stories of 9 girls around the world is still being used along with additional content as a gender equity curricula all around the world. And since Girl Rising, I've had the great privilege of joining Participant Media, which is a Hollywood-based film company. So to the point that 80% of content is produced in Hollywood, I'm now so excited to be working at a film company that was founded by Jeff Skoll, who believes in storytelling as a tool to inspire widespread change, and working on stories like, my first movie out of the box at Participant when I joined 4 years ago was RBG, the documentary around Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And Nahla talked about telling women's stories and stories of women's leadership to shift gender norms. Well, you couldn't have a better story than the life story of one of the greatest Supreme Court justices of our time. And following that movie, that documentary that was released in the spring of the same year, we also released On the Basis of Sex, which was the fiction, the narrative version of the same story. And the reason I use those as a parallel is because where the RBG documentary was a story of leadership and determination and accomplishment, On the Basis of Sex made the barriers that Ruth Bader Ginsburg faced as a woman graduating first in her class from Harvard and not being able to get a single job in a law firm, made those barriers visible and relatable. So most women in her time were spending that 3 hours cooking, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was hitting the streets and getting nothing but no's, and ended up as a professor at Rutgers because she couldn't get a law firm job despite graduating as one of the only women in her class at Harvard. So this idea of telling women's stories and telling stories and having women storytellers is vital. So those stories were both told about women by women storytellers. So the director of RBG Betsy and Julie, and Betsy West and Julie Cohen, and Mimi Leader, who made On the Basis. So important to have the stories on the screen and behind the screen.
Thank you so much, Holly. And building on, having women tell stories about women, Wendy Calhoun is definitely a BFF of mine and the Institute. And, Wendy, you've said, I, refuse to tell colorblind stories. And, considering, your trajectory, how did you establish your voice, in a writer's room starting out? And I would just love you to talk a little bit more about how you are approaching material, unique stories, and refusing to write colorblind stories.
It's so nice to see you, by the way, Madeline and Holly. I loved both of those films, both of the RGB and the second film. They were amazing. Michelle, the work you're doing, fantastic. Just wanted to acknowledge everyone for a sec. But yes, I have been on 8 different scripted series. I have produced or directed over 40 hours of unscripted entertainment. This is sort of give you some context. And on those scripted series, my approach for female characters, and by the way, there were several of those series where I was the only woman in the room. On my approach, it was often based on women I knew. I got my inspiration, and I still to this day get my inspiration from real live women and their stories and wanting to tell their stories. So my IP is walking the earth, and she's got all the complexities of any human being. And so it's important to me that from the moment that we start to conceive of a show, that you start to really think about the characters then. That it's not, when I say colorblind stories, well, what is that? Often in the United States, colorblind is default for white male. Let's just get it straight. You could write a script, you could have everybody be white male, and you say, well, we're going to colorblind cast, and you hand that script over to casting directors, and actually you put a lot of work in the lap of the performer, because now they're casting people who represent other identities and other cultures, but the piece isn't written for that. And the motivation isn't there. And all of the wonderful details and specificity that we look to as audience members for great stories is missing. So I'm not about that. I've been very honest about not being about that. I will say that in my journey on the scripted side, of the 8 series I've worked on, only 2 were created by women. That was Nashville with Callie Curry and Station 19 with Stacey McKee. And to be honest, because of that experience, and because the job has never been the destination for me, I, about 6 years ago, decided, you know what, the only way I'm going to be able to do my advocacy work, putting women front and center in my stories, is to create series. And it has been a 6-year journey, and I am still on that journey. And I have to say, this past year, in a pandemic, via Zoom, just like this, I sold 3 series, all have female leads. And it's very imperative that that happens. And so I want to just give you an idea of what that means. So I sold these series. And so yesterday we have one that's moving towards casting. And yesterday, my day involved talking to a female studio executive, a female streamer executive, a female possible showrunner for this show, what the female DP would be, what female editors we would have, our female, like it's just all the way down the line. That starts from the content, that starts from the seed that you plant, and you say that this seed is going to bloom, and it's going to bloom in a very specific way. And just by planting that seed, what happens is everybody who comes along to add, the fertilizer and the water and the tending, well, they're specific to that seed too. And if that seed is a female, what I find is that females now gravitate to every aspect of the story. And that's long before we've cast anyone to be on screen. So, I hope I answered your question.
You did, and of course I'll have a follow-up question for you on how to sell those seeds. But I'm going to turn now over to Elaine Bogan, who is the director of Spirit Untamed. And Elaine, I read that you said that, you know, you started thinking about your career when you were 4, because you were always drawing. And I'd love for you to talk about the power of voice, because for you, it started out as a story artist, and then you were able to very successfully navigate your way, and now you have your first feature directorial debut. So if you can just explain, you know, going from drawing at 4 to now directing, you know, a major feature film, if you can just, you know, share your journey and how you establish your voice, you know, through your art.
Sure, yeah. And first, thank you for having me here today. It's an honor to be here with all of you guys. What an awesome way to start Saturday morning. So I guess to start talking about how I came about finding a voice, I mean, it kind of speaks to what you guys are all saying. I feel like, you know, I started at DreamWorks at the very beginning of my filmmaking career as a story artist in a story trainee program. And as soon as I finished that trainee program and was placed onto my first real production, that production had a female producer and a female director. So I feel like right away I hit the ground running, set up with a perspective that was so positive and set the tone for the rest of my goals for the future of my career and what I was capable of. I was just, you know, I was surrounded by all these incredible female role models, and sort of came up in that kind of environment, and that was crucial. And you know, fast forward until now, it's become even more crucial that I now become that voice for other young generations coming into the studio. But you know, especially having gone through my first feature now, and I'll be brief about the story, but our movie is very much underneath the plot of it all. It's very much a story about a strong group of 3 young women all supporting each other in order to achieve the impossible, instead of, you know, competing with one another to get there first. So, and you know, not only do these 3 characters celebrate 3 very unique personalities and strengths, but they also each carry their own specific cultural backgrounds and upbringings, all 3 bringing something different to the story. And because of those underlying concepts in the message of our movie, you know, what kind of filmmakers or what kind of example would we be setting if we didn't replicate that on our own crew in the making of? So this very much became a focal point for myself, and for my incredible producer, Karen Foster, was a huge advocate of that as well. And then along the way, as we were casting, you know, we brought in 3 female writers. We initiated bringing in DreamWorks' very first female feature composer. We had tons of female story artists and production members. And along the way, it became more and more obvious to me that it wasn't enough for me to just bring these women in to do a job, but it became even more important to start supplying these women with the skills and the knowledge that they would need in order to move on and move up after this job was done. And that was, you know, it's, you know, I think it should be important for everybody.
Thank you so much. So Michelle, I'm going to go back to you, building on what you know, Elaine said about skills and knowledge. From your perspective, from a CAPE perspective, what are 3 actionable steps, recommendations to help address, you know, these issues, these diversity issues? What would be 3 practical things for everyone watching this session that you would like them to do? What would be 3 call to actions, 3 recommendations you would have?
Oh, how exciting. So I think, so first of all, it really is if you have a project that would require some expertise. So here's what I see a lot, especially just for Asian American Pacific Islanders generally. What we get is at the 11th hour, we'll get a script that may have been written by a non-person of color, a male. And essentially what they would like is what we call the soy saucing of it. So can we have an Asian American Pacific Islander writer do effectively an authenticity pass at the last second? And so really what we are pushing for is, if you're telling a story of a certain community, get them involved at the very beginning. Let them tell their own stories. And so like that is one thing that is really, really important, and something that we are seeing that is starting to happen more and more. And so I encourage people to think about that and be more conscious about how they're staffing up their projects when they're purchasing IP, who they're, for series, what does their writer's room look like? What does their executive suite look like? And to really be more intentional about their teams. And we've been working actually with participant on a few projects, and I love that they know and they come in early. And so I think that would just be so great to see more companies and studios doing that. And the second thing I would say is also to pay attention as to what you're paying your assistants. And so there's this movement, it's the hashtag Pay Up Hollywood. And really a lot of these assistants are working in very tough environments. They're not getting paid very much. In a city like Los Angeles, like the median income is something like $53,000, and assistance is being paid a lot less than that. And so just thinking about the barriers to entry for that, and especially in more marginalized communities who may not have privileged backgrounds where they can take a low-paying assistant job or even have the access to get the job in the first place, like that is a real barrier to entry. And so to be just more conscious about who we're letting into the club at the very beginning, and how do we broaden that pipeline to get more people in. And I had a third one and now I've just forgotten it. I would say also, if you are in certain positions, just to remember your power and your voice. I was talking to Nisha Ganatra, who is a director. She directed Late Night and The High Note. And one of the things that she said was, as a director, she just personally felt like she just didn't have the loudest voice. And so she would just always let her first AD yell cut. And one day, for whatever reason, she yelled cut. And after that, a bunch of below the line crew, women, came up to her and they said, we have been working in this industry for so long and we've never heard a woman's voice yell cut. And just like how powerful and impactful that was for them to hear it. And Nisha said she didn't even realize that, and she wasn't consciously not saying it. She was just like, oh, I don't have, my first AD has a lot of voice, it's fine. But that was her awakening. And so now she yells cut on set. And so just little things like that, that sometimes I think become just so ingrained in us that we don't think about it. And then we realize, oh, wow, this really does have an impact. So maybe just, if you are in whatever position you're in, every single person has their sphere of influence. Just think about how you could use that to uplift women and girls.
Thank you, Michelle. That was really great. One of the things I've always said is treat the assistant like the boss. The assistant is the gatekeeper. And if you want to get that meeting, you want to get your document through, you want to get your call put through. If you're sending flowers to the boss or a cactus, send one to the assistant. Trust me, your call will be put on the top of the return sheet. So Holly, I want you to put your business hat on. I want you to talk about being at the green light table and what that means. And also 3 things for our audience who may want to pitch participant or they want to get to that green light table. What would be 3 things that you would recommend?
So I just want to build quickly on what Michelle said about treat the assistant like the boss. Madeline, you saying that too, and how important it is to invest in assistants and really treat them fairly. I did a whole graduation speech at Mills College about the fact that if you could be a good assistant, you could be a great CEO. And so it really is this undervalued, incredibly valuable position, and across industries, because it's an entry point for Hollywood, I think you do see more boys, young men taking those roles, but consistently it's been young women who've had to like scratch their way out of an assistant chair in history. And so it is one of those, it's like caregiving, that I'm so glad to see so much investment in caregiving now as part of the Biden plan, because these care jobs that are so traditionally women's jobs are undervalued. And so lifting those stories is really important. So at the Greenlight table, so my role at the Greenlight table is very much about looking for the impact value of a piece of content, less looking at the business value, although I am at the Greenlight table and I am part of those conversations. So I'm a little bit out of my depth to really speak from a place of authority, but I do know what we're looking for from an impact perspective. And any piece of content that you pitch to participant must have a social purpose or a social angle to it. Because we make content to drive change in the world. And so when you're thinking about the stories you're telling, stories are always about individuals. What are the barriers those individuals, and they're always about a journey, right? About individuals in the world of humanity facing challenges. And so a participant film is one where our films almost always center on someone who shows courage, who stands up and speaks truth to power. Our films are rooted in the challenges that are beyond that we're facing, things like gender equity, things like climate. We made an Inconvenient Truth. Ideas of institutional transformation. Spotlight, right, is about the institution of religion not protecting its congregants. We just made Dark Waters with Mark Ruffalo and Anne Hathaway and Bill Pullman, and that's about big business not protecting communities because they're creating chemicals that poison people, right? So a participant story is one where human beings speak truth to power and try to see a better way. And I would say that's the consistent theme. People who are trying to make change in the world. He Named Me Malala, really relevant to this conversation. And one of the films, I'll loop back before I close, around how stories can make the invisible visible, related to this idea of the value of care work. I'll draw your attention to Roma, which on the face of it, Roma, why did we make Roma? Roma was Alfonso Cuarón's story of his childhood. And it was incredible working with Alfonso, because really what happened he was really interested in how his whole childhood kind of fell apart at the same time as Mexico was going through a revolution. And as he went into that story and he knew he wanted to tell it, what his great discovery was the important role that Cleo, his housekeeper and nanny, played in his life during that part of life. And so he centered the story on the story of Cleo, a real life housekeeper and nanny who's still with his mother today, and made her the most visible character in that film. And then he cast an unknown, marginalized indigenous community, member of an indigenous community, Yalitza, to play the role of Cleo. And in that decision of casting and in that decision of centering the story, we were able to help push legislation through across Mexico to protect domestic workers in partnership with CASE. So, how you connect a story, how you center a story, how you connect a story to impact organizations that are doing the work, that is actually how we see at Participant the flow from Greenlight, which is what is the story about and what's the power or dynamic we're trying to shift, through impact, which is who represents that and who's doing that work on the ground, and making that connection is how you actually travel from amazing storytelling into on the ground social change.
Thank you so much. So Wendy, now it's the other side, right? So connecting the story to the sale, do you have three, quick things that you could talk about in terms of the power of the pitch to help get your great story sold?
I do. I think, well, the most important thing with a pitch is passion. So it's the passion that you have for the stories that you want to tell, right? You want to, I like to present things now, especially in the Zoom era that we've been in. I like to have visuals because this is a visual medium. You should be able to describe your story, and it should bring pictures to life. So sometimes I will often, I'll put up a deck and I will share pictures that will help the buyers see what I'm seeing. And then another thing too is connection points, right? So one of my favorite quotes lately is, we connect through what's the same and we grow through what's different, right? And so I always try to look for those things with each of the characters. What are their arcs that I'm presenting, and how does that overall arc present itself in the pitch? And then there's just the fun things, right? It's play like it's a dinner party. You're bringing everybody there. You want everybody to have a good time. You're hopeful that you're going to tell them a story that makes them want to have a whole discussion with you, and you're starting to open up a dialogue, a debate about the story. When you kind of know you're on to something in terms of the content being relevant, because as Holly was saying, I believe all of those pictures that she talked about, they opened up conversations. And it's through those conversations that we have awareness, and it's through that awareness that we start to change our habits. And things like sexism and racism are habits. Things like that. These are some learned behaviors. And I know you've done a lot of work with unconscious bias. And so a lot of times what we're able to do and it starts with the pitch, is we start to look at, okay, what's the story I want to tell? Who do I want, to be the lead? And, I'll be honest, like I said, my leads typically are women and women of color. And okay, so now I want to start to look at that character from a different point of view. And it starts with a pitch. I start to, take you down the lane that's going to lead to conversation, debate, awareness, and eventually change. It's a long road. It's a long journey, and it's not always easy. I'll tell you one thing that I have discovered, just to overshare maybe, is that there are tropes about women that are still prevalent in Hollywood, and you have to push against them every single time. Tropes that women only have power when it comes to their sexuality. Like they can only turn a story based on whether they can romance a man. It's really tropes like, that, if a woman is in a power position, then she has no personal life. All kinds of tropes that I know from my own life, and all the women in my life are not true. And so we kind of have to, we have 100 years now of seeing, screen content that, let's be honest, is built on white male perspective. And now we're starting to see the shift. And in that shift, something beautiful is happening. First of all, we have an opportunity to tell stories from another perspective. So we're going to have fresher stories to begin with. Already, that's super fun. But also, we're starting to see that a lot of the stories that we told ourselves are based on lies. And so now we get to poke holes, talk about speaking truth to power. Well, when the power has been white male for so long, and now we're starting to re-examine that. Well, now you're starting to get content like, lately I've become a big fan of conquering all the brutes, or exterminate all the brutes, or these kinds of different stories now where we're going, hey, all those things we sort of took as true, that was myth. And now maybe the best stories right now is to deconstruct that myth. So that's an area too that I keep moving towards. Definitely.
Thank you so much. And I want to build, Elaine, I want to build on something that Wendy said, and this is our final, you have the final word. In terms of telling stories from a different perspective, I mean, animation, how animation is created, how the stories are developed, it's very different. And for the audience that may be interested in getting into animation, whether it be from a story artist, or like you, being a director, can you just give us kind of like, 3 points on what's the best, way in for someone who wants to get, in animation?
Yes. I know, well, to speak to the young generation not yet inside the industry, I would say it's really important to just get your authentic voice out there, whether it's on social media or through a mentorship program or going to school. Oftentimes when we're looking at portfolios and trying to crew up, we're looking for unique voices. And the only way you can express a unique voice is to be essentially truly who you are through your artwork. And if that is a unique voice, it will get seen, it will get noticed. And then to people who already have a foot in the door, a huge part of the animation industry is about being collaborative. Making an animated movie takes, for the most part, over 400 people per project. And all of those people have been where you are. And it's very, it's a collaborative environment full of people willing to mentor, answer questions, show you behind the curtain to see what really goes on in each department. So just ask all the questions and rely on all of the veterans around you. That's where I started. I started at DreamWorks as a 20-year-old kid, surrounded by all my heroes who had been working in the industry for 30, 40 years. And that I feel like, yeah, it's an industry full of people willing to help because we've all struggled and been there.
Thank you so much. So unfortunately, everybody, we're out of time. So I want to thank Andrea Lust, our ASL interpreter. I want to thank Elaine, Bogan, everybody tune in for Spirit Untamed. Wendy Calhoun, you are one of the most prolific storytellers that we know. We can't wait to see those, artists. Michelle, thank you so much for the recommendations for Cape, and Holly Gordon, again, love you, love participant. Thank you so much, everyone. And without further ado, I want to welcome a very, very long time friend of mine who I adore, Dani Zapotoczny, who is the Senior Director of Partnerships and Communications and a strategic advisor to the United Nations Creative Community Outreach Initiative. Take it away, Dani Z.
It is great to see you, Madeline and Holly and so many other good friends. And thank you for that amazing panel. It's been a really, really energizing morning. And I think the theme we keep seeing is women as leaders. And it's an exciting time to bring on our colleagues from the UN who are just really a group of really kick-ass women leaders who, when you look at the tropes you're talking about, Wendy, it's so true. There's these beliefs of what a woman can be, should be, and what you see on screen. And so it feels like a perfect transition moment to really jump in with some women who are long in the UN service. So you think of the big building, we think of New York, we think of people in suits, but it's the human beings who are the heart of the UN, who are out in the field, who are putting their lives literally on the line, who are making sacrifices every day and seeing stories in the field that we really all should know. So I'd love to just jump in with our colleagues here, Pernille, with Joung-Ah and with Andi, and hear about their stories and the people that they've seen on the ground, and also some of the work that they've already done with the creative community to connect it in. So over Joung-Ah, you actually have witnessed some of the greatest refugee crises in our time. You've worked in conflict zones, you've been in Bosnia and Kosovo and Rwanda. And we have day jobs where people go to offices or maybe they go to set, but what is that like for that to be your life's work? What does it look like on the ground to show up at a job at UNHCR and be doing that important work?
Thank you, Dani, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's really exciting, and I have to say I could have listened to the previous panel for another hour. So my day job is very unpredictable. it's very hard physically, emotionally, mentally. It's also, I think, the most rewarding work that any human being can do. I feel like with myself, I kind of fell into the work, to tell you the truth. And I think it's really quite timely that today is the start of Asian Pacific Heritage Month, because as a Korean Italian American, I think my own history is actually a part of how I ended up in this work, even though my family were very much against it. They really wanted me to be the lawyer, my sister to be the doctor. So when I ended up with my first job after graduate school, literally flying into Bosnia during the war, as you can imagine, with two parents who themselves experienced the Korean War and World War II in their respective countries of Korea and Italy. It was the last thing that they wanted. And I have to admit, I've been in this line of work now for 27 years. And thank goodness that I was young and brave, or maybe naive, because I remember the first time, my first mission was to go into Bosnia during the war. And my boss at the time just said, okay, you've been bothering me to go out to the field. It's baptism by fire. And so he basically said, get yourself, I was working with an NGO at the time, not with the UN. He said, get yourself into Bosnia. And so I had 2 satellite phones, which were like this big at the time, and a lot of cash. He needed cash. And I somehow got myself to Croatia. I got myself on a NATO flight, a big helicopter that flew me into Bosnia in the middle of the war. This was in 1994. And the day that I arrived was the day that the ethnic cleansing happened in Srebrenica. And so my literal first day on the job, I was there in Tuzla as 8,000 women and children arrived. And here I am, kind of new and green, and just the wailing of women and children, and no men at all. Maybe the oldest we saw men that were maybe in their 80s, and then boys until about 13 or 14 years old. And it was the most brutal day. But that day I really decided, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And it's been 27 years since. And there are still days where I just think I cannot do this anymore. I really want to just be a full-time yoga instructor. I did that for a few years as a break. I took a break and I taught yoga, and that's a different lifestyle. But I always come back, because it's actually the strength and the bravery and the humanity that I see every day with the refugee women and children and men that I meet. And I have to say, I think about them all the time. All these people that I've met, especially the ones that I've connected with.
Well, it's actually really good to hear the yoga piece, because I think there is a fallacy that we somehow believe that people like you all who go and put their lives on the line and go into these places, the UN is in places that no one else will go, the hardest of the hardest in reaching these. And we think you're superheroes that have a different DNA and a different ability. And you do in some ways, but at the same time, you're just amazing human beings who are willing to go through the things that are really hard. So thank you for that. And Pernille, you've in similar levels of heroism, your work with UNICEF, you've run operations in Iraq, and you've negotiated with warlords. And there's I think sometimes also a stereotype that women are sort of helping in the field and doing the humanitarian does not equate to leading, and you all are leaders. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like, the both the intensity on a personal level of that kind of a negotiation, but also just the scale of running an operation that's logistically, I can only imagine to be overwhelming.
Thanks, Dani. I'm so delighted to be with all of you today, and it's really an honor. And like my colleague, I could have listened to the previous panel for quite a while still. I think maybe I'll start by saying I did become the lawyer, and my parents thought, oh, great. But then I broke the news that actually the kind of law I'm interested in is public interest law and social justice issues. And that was my singular focus. And so my entry into the UN, which came in 2002, was through that avenue. And specifically, I ended up starting in a field called protection. So for UNICEF, it's child protection. So we're talking about protecting children and women from any kind of violence, exploitation, and abuse. And I felt the need, similar to Joung-Ah, to really, just dive in and understand and see where I may be able to help. I definitely do not categorize or anything that I've done as brave. It is, frankly, the bravery is in the people we're serving. With utmost humility, it's just every time I've encountered families fleeing, children, women who've been, abducted and who we've managed to negotiate their release, or who've been raped and who've undergone extraordinary circumstances to survive to where they are today. Those are our heroes, as are the colleagues who are closest to the field on a day in, day out basis. I've had the privilege to serve in multiple locations as well. And my first assignment was in Eastern Congo in Goma, where I thought I'd go for a year and ended up staying for 4 years. And it just, similar to Joung-Ah, it just really solidified that this is what I want to do. Not knowing quite fully how, what not only what impact you can have, but also the impact it has on you personally. And perhaps during this conversation, we can also speak about that, from as a woman, the kinds of choices and that one makes as a result of choosing a career and being primarily in conflict zones for that duration. But coming to your question, Dani, in terms of what is it like negotiating, for example, the release of children from armed groups? Well, it's unsavory to say the least, but it's an important choice to make, and one does it under the conditions of having, in most cases, a certain level of security in place and so forth. But I would much rather negotiate and know that that is a possible avenue towards releasing children and both boys and girls than not to. And that's men sitting across the table from men who are currently sitting in the International Criminal Court today, and with a considerable level of intimidation exerted against one during those situations, not just militarily in terms of the weapons, but through body language, through verbalization, things that they're saying as well. And in those scenarios, my singular focus is on always, firstly, doing the right thing, making sure that I'm not jeopardizing my team and keeping them safe, and then always trying to also aim for the best outcome for the people whom we're there to serve and whom we're there to protect. It doesn't always happen that day. There's plenty of times where, and I think that's one of the characteristics of being in such roles, is being flexible and yet determined and focused, being able to remain calm under extreme pressure and under inflammatory kinds of conditions, and being able to diffuse situations rather than escalate. And I think those are part of the qualities that women bring to the table in such circumstances, and that I try to be very aware of in terms of those positive differences vis-a-vis also what sometimes male colleagues can bring. Let me stop there for now.
No, that was wonderful. And it goes back to what Nahla was saying at the top about the difference in leadership styles and how you can accomplish different things. And so thank you. And Andi, you have in your time at the UN and at NBC, traveled to 60 different countries and conflict zones covering war and humanitarian issues and genocide. And curious to know what that's like being a woman. And also we've talked some about, as content creators, Pernille just said, doing the right thing by the people that you are there. And we share stories of these people who are in the field in order to be able to create change. Holly talked about it, and that ability that Girl Rising had to put these stories on the screen. And I teach a class and I show that film every year, and it opens minds up because it transports people and really lets them wrap their brain around it. But there's a balance of how do you tell those stories in a way that's respectful and helpful and it keeps people's integrity. So I'm from the side of what it's been like to do that work, and also how you balance that as we talk about these stories. How are we sharing them in a way that's creating change and impact, and doing that in all positive ways for the people that we're trying to help?
Great, thanks so much. And it's funny when you talk about, you certainly could have listened to the last panel as well, but also I could sit and listen to Pernille and Joung-Ah as well for hours. It's interesting because I started actually not as a doctor or a lawyer, but I started as a trauma psychologist, and kind of sitting in an office and talking with people who've experienced horrific things, and how do kind of ordinary people respond to in extraordinary situations. But I also would always be reading the news and books and documentaries and all the rest about what was happening kind of around the world with conflict and with genocide and war, and decided that maybe there was a way to marry the two. And it was a little bit when think of it from a female perspective, and you talked about the idea of what's it like as a woman to do this. It was that question of getting out there and trying to be bold in raising your hand for these kinds of stories also, and saying, I can do it, I can be there, I can lead in the way we need to, I can get these stories, I can endure whatever situations and kind of atmosphere it is, and dangers and the rest. So part of that was kind of getting in your own head and thinking that you can do this in a different way. And also I think there was the notion that as a woman, when I would approach this and when I would be in these situations, was so often the stories are about, when covering these kinds of things, genocide, conflict, violence, humanitarian, human rights, is about the movement of troops or rebel leaders or what's happening or what the conflict is about. And we talk about, what Nahla had spoken about so beautifully was this idea of making the invisible visible. There's so many female stories out there that weren't being told, that women, and when they were, it was often women as victims. And this idea of how do we make sure these stories are being told first and foremost? How are we looking at what these issues are and how people are being affected on the ground, women, girls, which doesn't preclude telling the other stories, of course. So many people are affected, but there are unique stories that relate to women and girls. And then how do we tell them sensitively, thoughtfully? How do we not portray people as victims, but these are survivors, and making sure that, as corny as they sound, but they have their own voice and that there's a power in what they're saying, which was incredibly important no matter where I was in the world, Bosnia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Sudan, the Middle East, no matter where I was in the world, that was the common theme, was that to tell the story and tell it thoughtfully and make sure these voices are heard and make sure people understood the resilience. But also, I think, so that was the sense of kind of looking for those stories and thinking about thoughtfully how to tell them. But also one thing that I realized was how so often the resilience of these women, how that also helped me in my own work. Many of these women turned to lead. So it would be in Bosnia, and like Joung-Ah, I was also in Bosnia during that time, and then in Rwanda, that many of the women that went on to take leadership positions, whether it was leading groups for survivors after, whether it was, or in Liberia, women became the peacekeepers, and they circled the hotels to make sure the men who were making peace couldn't leave until there was peace. But that level of resilience that you saw and that power that they found in these circumstances. So as a woman telling their stories, it was kind of extraordinary and amazing to see. So I think it's about making sure we're looking for really stories that may be unique and untold, bringing them to light, doing it again. And one thing Pernille said that I thought was really important was this idea of bringing a different perspective often. This, when you're in the field, this notion of possibly this staying calm, trying to diffuse, looking at it in just slightly different ways, and it absolutely plays out.
And thank you. And to that point of who those stories are, can you share with us, you know, Andi and Joung-Ah and Pernille, can you share with us someone or some memory that you still think about, you know, a story that you wish the world knew, that you'd be willing, I know it's sort of private in sort of some of the things you've experienced, but if there are things that you could convey just to this audience to give us a sense of who you've met, you know, because we do see a lot of victim stories, but there's also a lot of people that are very extraordinary in their own communities, creating change. And maybe Joung-Ah, back to you.
So there are so many women, honestly, and it is a lot of women. There are maybe because of our connection. I remember there's one woman. I went to Bangladesh just at the beginning of the Rohingya crisis, when all of the Rohingya were fleeing all the violence in Myanmar. As we're seeing, it's still ongoing. In fact, it's flaring up all over Myanmar. But I was there in just at the height when everybody was coming across the border, and because the land borders were blocked, and because the military were making it impossible for people to flee and cross from Myanmar into Bangladesh, they started taking these incredibly dangerous sea journeys. The types that we see across the Mediterranean, so many places. There was a day that we heard about the arrival of many boats. These are these tiny little carved wooden dhows. And I met a family. I'm gonna try not to get too emotional. I met a family, it was a mother, a father, and there were 4 children, but one didn't survive. And the mother, she said that, you know, they didn't want to flee, but it got to the point where the entire village was razed. They saw their house being burned. She saw her parents being killed, her brother being killed. And so they just decided, we have to go. We have to risk our lives and try to go. And the boat made it to, they could see the shoreline, and they were so excited. She expressed through a translator how excited she was. And then just as they were coming into shore, a huge wave came and the dhow capsized, and nobody knew how to swim. And the mother and the father and the oldest teenage daughter could actually stand. The water was about this high, and there were 3 younger children. And she grabbed 2, but she, as she said, she only had 2 arms, and her husband was behind her. And by the time they came out, their 4-year-old daughter had drowned. And clearly, I don't speak the language, but I'm a mother. So, and she was trying to be so strong for the other kids. The other kids just kept looking towards her to see, like, is my mom okay? If she's okay, we're okay. And they were the kids were so excited just to have reached land. They were sad, but they just felt the relief of having made it. And so she was trying to smile and to comfort them. And at one point I looked over at her and we just locked eyes. And I just held her hands and we just cried together. And there was nothing I could do for her. There was absolutely nothing I could do for her. But I know without a doubt that she understood that I was there and that I was just witnessing for her and just you know, trying to just connect with her as another human being from the other side of the world. But there are very few weeks that go by when I don't wonder how they are, where they are the other kids okay? Did they finally get to school? The 15-year-old daughter was so excited because she hadn't been able to go to school in 5 years. And she just was saying, I can't wait to go back to class. But I think about that mother and how hard she tried to keep up this strong facade for the sake of the other kids. That's bravery. I mean, as much as I appreciate everyone saying that we're heroes, we're really not. We're lucky to do this job, but these people are, the people that I've met are just, they're incredible. They are incredible. They survive the unthinkable and they carry on with such grace and dignity. And it's really just such, it's the luckiest thing I get to do other than being a parent. It's honestly the best thing I could do.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I think we'll all probably continue to think of that family. And like you said, that motherhood of those moments where you do anything for your kids, anything sacrifice wise and anything to just fake it till you make it so they think it's okay. And so that they'll be as okay as they can be. So, and it also made me think of, you know, the word refugee, and we talked about that the other day, and it paints such a different picture. You know, certain words start to take on different meanings, and what it means to be a refugee and who these people are and where they're going and where they're coming from. So thank you for that. Pernille, do you want to share some of what you experienced?
Yes, and holding space and being able to demonstrate that you are witnessing and caring. Those are experiences that we experience regularly when we're in these working in these situations. But some stand out much more than others. I'm going to share two vignettes, and they have different perspectives. One is, I think of the Nepali girls that I helped to have them released from the Maoist armed movement. This was about 2009, and you know, they were actually really unhappy to go back to their families and their communities, and the reason was that within the Maoist movement, they were significantly more empowered than they were in their families and communities and in Nepali kind of, let's say, general society. And they had, in some cases, they had prominent military positions, they had command roles, and they were treated equally. And so I think of those girls, and they were underage, and so regardless if a child, boy or girl, is under the age of 18 and is in whether in an armed group or a government force, we do advocate for that they be released and be provided with an opportunity to for schooling or skills building and training, and then they can choose to rejoin if that's their decision. But I think about those girls because and we did provide a range of I'd say meaningful kind of training opportunities aside from straight education for them. But knowing how difficult it would be to reintegrate into their communities, into their families, how they may even be shunned, and other girls as well in different situations who maybe had a child at this stage out of wedlock, all kinds of circumstances that make it much more difficult for them to kind of resume, let's say, daily life within their families. It really strikes me, and I just hope that the outcome was as we had planned for it to be in those circumstances for those girls, and that they found their power back and were able to, regardless, still use that positively in their own lives. On the flip side, I had there's one girl in particular in Eastern Congo who will stay with me forever. And she was raped. She's 7 years old. She had been raped. Her parents had been killed during a village raid. I met her at the Panzi Hospital in Bukavu, where we were supporting Dr. Mukwege and his team together with V-Day, which is Eve Ensler's organization. And we had started a movement called Stop Raping Our Greatest Resource, Power to Women and Girls in DRC. And we were at a launch event for this, and this little girl was basically standing, leaning against me. I didn't know her previously, and she kind of was inching closer to me, leaning on me, and I just thought, okay, well, she's looking for kind of proximity, let's say, and I scooped her up and put her on my lap. She was just a really lightweight, scrawny girl. I didn't know her full story. She was resisting coming on my lap, and I didn't force her, but then she did. And then, and basically she was like glued to me from then on, actually. And it was very sweet, but I found out her story. Her story was that she had been raped so badly that she had fistula, and she couldn't control her bowels or her bladder, and was thus completely petrified that she might soil me, a foreigner, somebody who she perceived to be, their kind of unusual, and just knowing that this child who'd lost her parents, who'd lost her childhood, her innocence, and yet was craving just that simple gesture of being hugged and being cared for, that feeling, and knowing that, you can do all the care in the world for a child like that. You can't bring back and erase those experiences, but you can put things in place to support her and to have surgery when she's of age, because she was still at least 6 years too young to be able to have those surgeries. I think of her, I think of what her future is today, knowing she's undergone such incredible brutality. And I think my experience is going into such contexts, going into camps for internally displaced people, being a woman, I find that there's an accessibility there that is unique to women, where in a way, whether it's through eye contact or it's through how you approach them, you recognize and acknowledge, you pay respect, you interact with their children. I'm always just so humbled at how open people are towards you, that it's, they don't have to be, of course, and you want to demonstrate that care and that you're there to help them. And that, I do think that we as women bring a unique ability to create that environment that we cannot take for granted. And that's one of the angles of the stories that I hope you would consider in bringing out. Back to you, Dani.
I think you bring love, like you clearly, it is hard work, and you bring love to everything you're doing. And that makes all the difference in the world, because you're clearly touching, and I'm sure there's many more people that you've touched in this way, because you're going in a way that's vulnerable and open. And so, yeah, so thank you. And Andi, in your time, I'd love for you to talk a little bit, because as as I suspected, our time is going by. I could talk to you all for hours. If you could talk a little bit about sort of how the work you've seen has connected already into Hollywood, and then maybe if there's something you wish, for the world to know, if there's a call to action or some piece of information or something you'd want to share, and then we can sort of round out by concluding with everyone sort of sharing what that one thing is they'd love everyone to take away with them.
Sure. Thanks. And just echoing what Pernille and Joung-Ah said about the people that stay with you forever. And I won't get into that because I know just for time, but I do want to say that again. I think for me, the people that I can't forget, certainly their individuals and their stories, but also their oftentimes capacity for forgiveness. And when we'll speak to, so many of the women that I had profiled who had endured unimaginable horrors, spoke about the importance for them of forgiving, not for others, but for themselves and the power that that brings to them. And it could be a very long process. And also sometimes the need to help others who are experiencing something similar. So again, those are often the stories and the people and the individuals that I'll never forget. But bringing all of the work I think that all of us have done in the field into creative community, I've been incredibly lucky to be able to work with The Handmaid's Tale, which I know was mentioned earlier, and sitting in the writer's room and talking, and sometimes just for full days, just talking about these kinds of stories. Not even getting a script and trying just to look it over and check it for authenticity and integrity, but really that notion of sharing the kinds of things you see in the field, the idea that things are not one-dimensional. They're oftentimes not even what you see on screen, whether it's in film or television. That's sometimes the idea that people have of what and how something plays out, when the reality is often very, very, very different. And if not very different, multi-layered and very, very complex. And so, we'll sit and we'll talk about what something actually is versus what writers may think it to be, as well as just talking about how something unfolds, and that can trigger sometimes thoughts and characters and story points that may not have kind of been there at the beginning. So hopefully, and so, at the end of the day, we know people often are not making documentaries, they may be making creative, fiction, but there's still a reality and an authenticity and integrity to that. And so I guess if I had to say one thing, it's really that notion of looking at the sense that there is a whole world, a whole big world out there, and a world in which people are both living again with unimaginable horrors. 1 in 5 people don't have electricity. 80 million people displaced. I mean, there's just. But within that, so being able to think about what that means and what that looks like, really, again, dimensions, the unpredictable, the unknown part of that, really being able to capture that. And then also that sense, though, of power, resilience. And it's true, for the women I've met and also for the men that I've covered and work on the stories for the UN as well. So.
Thank you. Joung-Ah, over to you.
I think, one of the things that I'm so proud of is that I'm the first woman of color that's leading global communications for UNHCR. And it's allowing me to bring all my own perspective, but also really take into account not only gender equity issues, but all the types of stories that need to be told by the people who own those stories rather than by me or my colleagues. And so I think I'd actually like to share a really hopeful story just to round out my contribution, which is that this summer, after a delay because of the COVID pandemic, there's going to be a refugee Olympics and Paralympics team that will be competing at Tokyo. And these men and women are unbelievable. They're absolutely incredible. There's, just to give you an example, Yusra Mardini is a young Syrian woman. She's a swimmer. She was training as a swimmer, as a student, upper middle class family. She and her sister were the only ones that the parents could afford to send with smugglers basically across the Mediterranean. Their small dinghy started taking in water. There were 25 people on the boat, many of whom couldn't swim. And she and her sister just said, we're swimmers, we're trained swimmers, we're athletes, we're not gonna die like this. And the two of them jumped in the water and kicked until that dinghy reached shore for hours. And she competed at Rio and she'll compete again this year. We have Cyril, who is a weightlifter who is in the UK. He is this big bear of a man who's also a nurse for the British healthcare system. So he's been working the whole time on the front lines of the COVID pandemic, and then he trains at night. And he has actually surpassed any record by anyone on the British team. And so we're really excited to see him. And then we have a number of refugees living with disabilities who are going to be competing, who one is Ibrahim, who is also Syrian. He lost his arms when he was actually rescuing his friend who had been hit by shrapnel. And he decided, that's it, I'm gonna get back. I'm gonna get back to doing everything that I did before. And in fact, I brought him to lead my whole team in a warm-up exercise at our last retreat, and it was unbelievable. I mean, just the vitality, the hope, the dedication, and the determination of these men and women are incredible. So I would really suggest there's a short film called The Journey that we've put out across social media. I really suggest everyone watches that. It's just incredible. And everybody root for them at the Tokyo Olympics this summer.
Gladly, they sound extraordinary. And I think back to that point that, they're extraordinary people, period. That's exciting. And Pernille, I'll go to you last.
Thanks. Maybe just to leave, I've had the opportunity to interact with producers on various occasions from actually since 2008, and the first invitation to the Jackson Hole Film Festival with the Secretary General of the UN, and then with the series The Revolution, speaking also with James Manos on some of his work, things he was working on. I think there's definitely much more that can be told from several perspectives. One is the story of what women and children and people go through particularly in armed conflict, but even in horrendous natural disasters. Like I was part of an immediate response team in the Philippines to the super typhoon there some years ago. And then there's also the backstory of humanitarian workers, and I would say particularly also from a female perspective, because what you don't see is that while we are all aiming for gender equality, as my colleague Nahla was saying earlier, the reality is in a number of these conflict zones, you are one of very few women, and you're contending not only with interacting with male, often military, whether it's government forces or also in my case, rebel leaders, but you're also contending with male UN peacekeepers and male colleagues who themselves have a certain kind of preconceptions as to what it is like to interact with women. And I'm sadly one of those women in the UN who has had to file a complaint of sexual harassment and abuse. And I was sure to do it because if one of the roles I can play, it is internally vis-a-vis my other female colleagues, whether as peers or as more junior colleagues, and setting an example as to what is intolerable and should be addressed immediately. And fortunately, it is improving and there is more of a spotlight on this, but there is a unique set of pressures on women, humanitarian workers in the field when you're working, and those pressures are both external, but they also come internal within the organization. And then that's not even to mention the personal choices and factors that also come into one's life in terms of whether it's relationships or postponing or deciding whether or not to even be able to have a family of oneself. And all of those factors, are generally more challenging as women. And you often get, if you're good at working in these difficult circumstances in conflict zones, well, then you're a go-to person. And yes, can you go there? And oh, could you, after that one, could you go to one more? And in my case, finally, after Iraq, after doing Yemen, Gaza war, Baghdad, I said, I need to go to a family duty station and see if, I can even in my 40s still manage to have a family. And happily, I am a single mom by choice of a 3-year-old now, and that worked out. But it's not always the case. I have a lot of colleagues who've got regrets who weren't able to make that choice for themselves in time.
And I know we're on borrowed time with the nap, so it's a perfect moment to say thank you all for all the work that you do, for the heart you do it with. If anyone wants to get in touch with any of these incredible women, like Ramu said, CCOI is the program, Creative Community Outreach Initiative run by the UN, and we'll be following up, and there'll be contact information, and we'd love to connect with any of you. And just so thank you all for joining us today, and back over to Will.
Thank you, Dani. I'd like to begin this segment with a quote from South African cleric and theologian Desmond Tutu, who said that it is by standing up for the rights of girls and women that we truly measure up as men. In that spirit, I'm honored to be able to participate in this event today with so many outstanding women whose work is so inspiring. And now we have an opportunity to pose questions to the moderators and panelists. As Kate noted at the outset, please post yours in the Q&A section, which you can access at the bottom panel of Zoom. Madeline, I'd like to turn the tables on you for a second and ask you if you could talk a little bit about the Geena Davis Institute and how you work with creators, writers, producers, directors, especially in a consulting capacity to help guide and shape stories and characters. And as a second part to that, where does the Bentonville Festival fit into the picture in terms of supporting and showcasing such works?
Thanks, Will. And I just want to say I'm just so deeply moved and humbled by the discussion today. So thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and stories. So we're a think tank, and Geena discovered early on back in 2004 that having data was the key to back up and drive, advocacy. And, there's different lanes to how we're all advocating for better representation. And one of the things that we noticed, what we consider the low-hanging fruit, is really what's happening on screen. And it wasn't until Geena had the data in her hand that she was able to quantify the discrepancy and the gender inequity, which at that time it was 3-to-1. Now it's down to kind of like 2-to-1 in terms of male and female. And however, though, the disparity in terms of hiring and behind the camera, people have known for decades and decades. So our approach has always been to use the data to drive on screen. And what we have done is just measure the industry, and we've taken the data directly to content creators. So rather than encouraging consumers to storm the gates of their neighborhood Hollywood studio, it's really been about providing data. And so we have been successful in terms of validating our theory of change, in that in 2019 and 2020, we were able to achieve gender parity for female lead characters in the top Nielsen rated kids shows and the top 100 grossing, family films out of the US. Now, when it comes to, people of color, which in the US, it's about 38%, we're not at parity. We're starting to hit that 30% mark. And of course, when you break that down, as Michelle alluded to early on, the representation of AAPI, MENA, et cetera, is just dismal, barely, existent. We use an intersectional lens, so we do look at gender, race, LGBTQ+, disabilities, age, body type. And there's a few ways. We consult, and many of my colleagues consult. 2, we provide customized measurement. We do a lot of auditing, and particularly with the parallel pandemic to fight racial injustice, we've been leaning in and doing a lot of auditing and, evaluation and making, recommendations. So we work with people in terms of the pre-production side of it. We have a tool called Spell Check for Bias, which looks at scripts. And then we have kind of an auditing tool called GDIQ, which looks at audio and video. And we have found these tools to be helpful because it's a data-driven conversation that diversity, equity, inclusion executives can have with their creative counterparts. And it's proving to be one way of achieving change. Thank you.
Thank you. And where does the Bentonville Festival fit into the picture for you all?
Well, as Geena said, why should the only film festivals, be chaired by guys named Bob? So we're going on our 7th year. We were approached by our partners at Walmart, who really wanted to put a stake in the ground. And the Bentonville Film Festival was born out of a need to really celebrate women and diversity, in film. And that's how that came about. And Geena was invited to chair that effort. And we've had a lot of success. A lot of our winners have gone on to direct, major feature films, which, you can max out your credit cards and get your first film made, but to really get your second and third is a whole nother, effort. And so yes, and our new dates are August 3rd through the 5th this year, and we hope you will all attend. It will be virtual, but we hope all enjoy.
Thank you. So Wendy, I've got a 2-part question for you. You certainly created strong female characters who had to learn how to win in a male-dominated world in Empire. So what was your inspiration for writing about those? And the second part of it from one of the participants in the Q&A was, how can males be better allies to espouse more of these stories? Any specific pointers that companies can make to improve upon corporate culture at a production company?
Okay, well, let's see. The first question about Empire, I think a lot of that was digging into a mother, the journey of a mother. And I feel like that's something so universal, right? And we all have mothers. Many of us are mothers, and so just trying to get beneath that and show her love and what it means to unconditionally love, and what it, meaning your child, even as her child. I mean, in the season 1, she had a child who was in the closet and was coming out with his homosexuality. And I remember dreaming up the episode where that happened. It was very fun for me. It was fun on that show because we could come up with story and that story would become songs. And so I had this dream. I knew that Cookie she was gonna go back with Lucius and she would want to celebrate by taking one of his songs that he had written for her that got her through her time in prison. And she would want to put her sons on it. Her sons would do a verse. And so the idea was that they were going to present this song at a white party. This was the whole thing that I just like dreamed up. Came in one day to the room. I said, here's the idea. Well, that turned into You're So Beautiful, which was the signature song of the first season. It also, part of my pitch was, and Jamal's going to take the pronoun of she that Lucius sang about his love for Cookie and turn it into he. And that's how he's going to come out, a pronoun. I mean, that's like the power of a pronoun, right? And that's what we did. And that was super fun. But it really did come out of what would a mother love to do? And really that story was about a mother bringing her family together. Her boys had been fighting, and she wanted to bring them together. So that was really a lot of the context. And I approached Lucius the same way, by the way. How do I humanize this somewhat trope of what a rapper is supposed to be? How do I humanize this person? And a lot of it came from how do I show him being a father, and being loving towards these sons. So that was an interesting journey. Okay, the second question, men as allies. I think about this a lot. And there are some great, materials out there, by the way. I'm certainly not an expert in this field, but I'll tell you my takeaways. Co-sign, my goodness. When a woman is stepping up and expressing something, support her, let her know that she's being heard and co-sign that thing that you feel like she said, that acknowledgement is so important, especially as we're coming up as young women and we're around these creative spaces and these creative tables. Oftentimes we are outnumbered. We need to know we have allies. So it's not enough to just be an ally, after the Zoom where you text her later and you're like, hey, great job. No, be an ally on the Zoom, co-sign it so that everyone can see that you're an ally and that she is feeling that boost of confidence. I know that the men in my career who've done that for me, they're invaluable. They make me feel comfortable enough to pitch that crazy out of the box idea because I know that they're listening, but not only listening, but they'll say, that was good. Let's talk about that some more. And that really, really helps. Another way to be an ally is invite the woman into those spaces where she may not have been invited in the past. Now, I don't mean this in a weird way. I mean this in a good way. I'm talking about make her a member of the club, okay? You're gonna go out and play golf with your buddies? Have a woman join you out there, okay? All those spaces, the guys are gonna get together and they're gonna watch the game. Invite her to come. I mean, because we're not in those spaces. And as we start to become part of those spaces and we start to bring men into our spaces, those conversations start to happen and we naturally become allies because we become friends and we break each other down so that we're seeing the humanity in each other. So those are my recommendations.
Well, thank you for that. Holly, a two-part question for you as well. You had mentioned actual on-the-ground social change that resulted from Roma. Can you expand upon how a participant goes about assessing and measuring social impact, including any tools that you use as part of the process? And how do you go about partnering with organizations such as NDWA and Ajahn to affect these outcomes?
So thanks for that question. I'll start with the former because it relates to the latter, which is in our campaign development process. We try to get really particular about what is the change that we're trying to make. Depending on this kind of film, that can actually be quite challenging because if you can imagine that documentaries are often very pointed and very specific, that makes it a bit easier. You can be more strategic from the very beginning. But narrative films are much more open. And yet the sort of dichotomy is that with the documentary, you have a surgical tool, very precise. but it's not going to reach as many people because docs just don't. With the narrative film, the impact message might be, you can watch Roma and never really think about domestic worker rights. But Roma was on the Academy Award stage. So how do you, and reached hundreds of millions of people around the world through Netflix distribution. So how do you, you have to design both your measurement tools, but also really your strategy quite flexibly and particularly for each campaign. That said, there are three ways that we consistently try to drive change. One is inspire people to make them more aware. So how might you use a film to lift consciousness and drive awareness around a particular issue? The second is empower. How might you empower people with tools, pathways, and opportunities to make change? And the third is how might you use films to connect people, because movements are stronger and change making is stronger when you can connect both important constituents, key constituents, and more constituents who may care about similar issues. And so we have a second set. So if that's an overarching framework of how we build campaigns, we connect first with the organizations that are working on the issues that are inside the film, the content. We try to ask them, what might be a strategic win for this film? Is it greater awareness or is it particular action? And then we design a campaign that meets the needs of the movement and our nonprofit partners. And then we measure ourselves against the particular metrics that we decided for that campaign. And so I wish I could say, here's the handbook, but it is very particular, and because it's very driven by the needs of the partners and the needs of the moment, and the scale of the film and the context of the film, it varies all the time. I'll round out with a piece of useful information, however, which is the Doc Society, which used to be called Brit Talk. They are a team of, they're mostly focused on documentary work, Doc Society, but they have a portal called the Field Guide for Impact Producers. And they also do a lot of impact studies. And as a practitioner of this work myself, I have often looked at their case studies to think about impact design and used their tools, and they're available to anyone to think about how do you say what I just said, but piece by piece, how do you think about designing impact campaigns and designing your metrics and getting crystal clear on what you're trying to do? Because the challenge for every social impact producer is when you ask your filmmaker, well, what do you want it to do? They say, well, I want everyone to do this thing. And we all know in trying to do anything that when you start with an audience of everyone and you say you want them to do everything, that's you got to kill your darlings and get way more specific. And so you need tools. We're humans. We need tools to figure out how to get more specific. Thanks, Kimberly. Awesome.
Thank you, Holly. And Dani, I want to turn the tables on you as well and ask you a question. And it'd be interesting to learn how you go about establishing relationships with creatives who may be working on projects that address issues of social concern. For example, how did you connect with Lucasfilm? Because the UN Foundation is a separate entity, although it works sort of hand in glove closely with the UN. But how do you go about it as wearing the hat of the UN Foundation?
So my background actually was as running a production company. So I ran a production company for 10 years in LA, and that was sort of the natural transition. I was a public policy major back in the day, but my time in Los Angeles built this network and also just an understanding that helped as I really started with Holly, and I worked in Girl Rising early and kind of was that first transition. But I think that network is really what opened up the conversation. And then over the years, working with the team at the UN and CCOI to really open the doors and say the UN's open for business, it became a natural connecting point where, people reach out. Holly reached out to do a Minions PSA when COVID hit. So there's a natural sort of just human connectivity, I think, as the network of networks has grown. And just always looking for really good people. So I'm always using my network to hunt down, Pernille helped with Revolution with J.J. Abrams' production company. And we saw there was a TV show about the world losing access to energy. And so we just figured out a way to get to Eric Kripke, who was the showrunner, and to JJ and Katie. So it's always a combination.
And how do people go about approaching you and initiating that sort of contact?
LinkedIn, email address. I can pop my email address in here, and CCOI has a web page that will pop in here as well, so that you can reach out to Andy or Carlos or anyone on the team, but I'll pop my email in the chat as well.
Thank you.
My last name's really easy, Zapotoczny.
So Andy, I want to give you the last word as the head of Advocacy, Civil Society and Entertainment Industry Engagement of the UN Department of Global Communications. So that's a mouthful. Can you give some sort of detail as to how you determine which filmmakers and stories you support and how you go about working with a larger creative community?
Great, thank you. Yes, no, it doesn't quite roll off the tongue. And so UN is big on acronyms, so it's CCOI is the way that we refer to it. But indeed, as Dani mentioned, there is a website, which really will also explain a lot and show a number of examples of the past kind of work that we've done in collaborations and ways to align in ways that we can support. So again, the idea really is that we can support, in all ways, from location filming, but also the idea of intellectual property, the kinds of stories that exist out there, both in terms of UN itself, but also, all the work that the UN is doing around the world, which is, kind of on every topic and theme that you can imagine. And then we work really closely. It's an exceptional team. And it's a team that really has had most of the team has been there from the beginning, from the inception, but it's really working also on a very bespoke level. So there's certain fundamentals and principles, but it's also looking at each project very, very specifically to figure out how we can help, what's the point of entry, what are the needs, how can we connect, across the UN has, as you heard from Joung-Ah and Pernille, just unbelievable people who have seen so much, done so much, and have such expertise that we can connect. So it's everything from the beginning, from idea generation all the way through execution. And this is a service and something that's really important to the UN, because for us, it's about raising awareness of these issues, hopefully having impact, making sure that there's that by people seeing these stories on the screen and connecting, because we always say that kind of 1 million people is a statistic and 1 person is a tragedy. So it is the idea ultimately of human story and connecting to people in a way that helps you to understand the issues, but again, in a very narrative driven way. So it's from stories to also campaigns and ways to join in that way as well. So we'll put the CCOI in there, but again, it's kind of our privilege to be able to do.
Thank you for that. And we're up in our time. I feel we could go on to a whole list of other questions I never got to, and there are a lot more in the chat, but for future sessions. In closing, I want to thank all of the moderators and panelists and our creative community outreach partners from the UN and the UN Foundation for their informative and inspiring contributions today and in the planning of this event. I also want to particularly thank our PGA production colleagues, Kate McCallum, Anne-Marie Gillen, Michelle Bird, and Diana White, and the other members of the PGA SIE task force for their substantial contributions to planning, organizing, and producing this event. And for the members of our audience, we thank you for your participation and look forward to having you at our next event.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, all.